I'm a 26-year-old guy, and I recently had an experience that feels too ridiculous to be true. But here I am, sharing it, hoping it makes sense to someone out there. This whole mess started when I got an opportunity for a month-long work trip abroad. It was a big deal for me, a chance to grow in my career, network, and explore a new country. Before I dive into what happened, let me set the stage. My family is complicated. My older brother is 28. Let's just say he's always had a knack for making bad decisions, from skipping jobs to sinking his money into things like business ideas that never materialized. My parents, on the other hand, have always been soft on him. They've bailed him out more times than I can count. Meanwhile, I've always been the one expected to work hard, keep my head down, and stay responsible. I still live at home, but I've worked hard to carve out a space that feels like mine. My room isn't just a place to sleep, it's my sanctuary. I've saved up to furnish it with things I care about, a custom desk, shelves filled with books, and even some sentimental stuff like trophies from high school and old journals I've kept since I was a kid. It's the one place in the house that truly feels like mine. When the trip came up, I made sure everything in my room was secure. I locked up my drawers, put some valuables in a safe, and even went as far as taking an inventory of my more sentimental items, just in case. Before leaving, I decided to give my brother a spare key. It felt unnecessary at the time, but I thought, what's the worst that could happen? He's my brother. Besides, it was only for emergencies. The day I left for the airport, he was unusually chatty. As we hugged goodbye, he joked about finally putting my space to good use. At the time, I laughed it off. That's just the kind of thing he says, a bit sarcastic, a bit offbeat. I chalked it up to his personality and didn't think much of it. The first couple of weeks abroad went smoothly. Work was intense, but I managed to squeeze in some sightseeing here and there. My parents and I exchanged texts now and then, but their responses were shorter than usual. I figured they were busy, or maybe I was just reading too much into it. My brother was even less communicative, which wasn't surprising. That's how he's always been, aloof unless he needs something. Then, around the 2-week mark, I called him just to check in. He picked up, but the call felt rushed. I could hear voices and laughter in the background, which he quickly dismissed as friends hanging out. I let it slide, but something about the way he brushed it off stuck with me. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I convinced myself I was overthinking. A few days later, I got a text from my neighbor. It was short and cryptic. Hey, just checking in. Noticed a lot of strange cars at your house lately. Everything okay? That's when my suspicion turned into genuine concern. I called my parents immediately, but they dodged my questions. My dad claimed everything was fine and that I should focus on enjoying my trip. My mom echoed the same sentiment, saying, don't stress over nothing. Now, I don't know what possessed my coworker to suggest this, but during a random conversation, she joked about looking up short-term rental listings online. It was meant as a lighthearted comment, but it planted a seed in my mind. That night, out of sheer curiosity, I started browsing. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until I stumbled upon a listing that stopped me cold. The photos showed my room, my bed, my bookshelves, even my desk, complete with my custom setup, and my personal belongings on display. It wasn't just a random photo that happened to look like my room, it was my room the listing boasted about, the modern, cozy space with personal touches that made it feel like home. One of the photos even had my journal in plain view on the nightstand. I froze. I didn't know whether to scream or cry. Instead, I did the only thing that made sense in the moment. I called my brother. He answered with his usual nonchalant tone, and when I confronted him, he admitted it without hesitation. He'd listed my room on a rental platform, claiming it was to help with bills. He didn't apologize. He didn't even seem embarrassed. Instead, he brushed off my anger like it was no big deal, saying I was overreacting. By then, I was seething. I called my parents next, hoping they'd back me up, but they shocked me even more. They sided with him. My dad said, he's going through a hard time. He didn't have another choice, and my mom added, it's not like he heard anything. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My private space had been violated, my trust shattered, and my own family thought it was fine. That's when I decided I was going home early. Whatever was waiting for me there, I needed to face it head on. Update 1. I flew home 2 weeks earlier than planned, arriving late in the afternoon. My heart was racing as I approached the house. I hadn't told anyone I was coming back, partly because I didn't want to give my brother or parents a chance to spin more lies. I just needed to see things for myself. As I unlocked the front door, everything looked normal at first. The living room was a bit messier than usual, but nothing out of the ordinary for my family. Then, I climbed the stairs to my room. That's when everything changed. The door to my room was closed, and I could hear muffled voices inside. My stomach dropped. I swung the door open, and there was a stranger, a guy, probably in his mid-30s, lounging on my bed with his laptop. He looked just as shocked as I was. Before I could even process what was happening, he stammered something about having a right to be here and pointed to his rental agreement. The guy handed me his phone, showing me a booking confirmation for my room. According to him, he had rented the room for 3 months and was only 2 weeks into his stay. He mentioned he had paid in advance and was told it was a spare guest room. There was no mention of me, the actual owner of the room. I was furious, but I couldn't take it out on him. He was clearly just as blindsided as I was. I apologized and told him he needed to leave immediately. He wasn't happy about it, understandably, but he packed his things and left after a bit of back and forth. I promised to contact the platform and help him sort out a refund if I could. Once he was gone, I took a closer look at my room. It was like stepping into a nightmare. My books were shoved into a corner. My desk chair was missing. My bedding had been replaced with some cheap, generic set. Worse, some of my sentimental items, my journals, an old photo album, and even a small trophy from a childhood competition were nowhere to be found. I stormed downstairs and found my brother in the kitchen, casually scrolling through his phone. He didn't even look surprised to see me. When I confronted him, he shrugged and said something about just trying to help with the bills. He acted like it was no big deal, as if renting out my personal space without my knowledge was a normal thing to do. That's when my parents walked in. They must have heard the shouting, because they immediately tried to calm things down. Instead of siding with me, though, they started defending my brother. My dad said he was just trying to help the family, and that I shouldn't be so dramatic. My mom chimed in, saying I was being selfish and materialistic, caring more about things than about my family's struggles. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My trust had been completely violated, and instead of support, I was being guilt-tripped. After that argument, I went back upstairs to assess the damage. The more I looked, the angrier I got. The lock on my safe had been tampered with, and while most of the items inside were untouched, a few small things were missing. My desk had scratches all over it, and some of my books looked like they'd been handled roughly. It was clear that the so-called tenant hadn't treated my belongings with any care. The situation got worse when my brother took to social media to air our dirty laundry. He posted a long rant about how I was kicking someone out onto the street, and how I was ungrateful for everything our family has done for me. Of course, he conveniently left out the part where he rented out my room behind my back. The post gained traction among our extended family, and before I knew it, I was getting texts from cousins and aunts asking why I was being so cruel. The next day, I called a lawyer friend to get some advice. He told me I could absolutely take legal action against my brother for unauthorized entry and damages, but he warned me that it could escalate tensions with my family. I was already at a breaking point, but I decided to hold off on legal action for the moment. Meanwhile, I reported the unauthorized listing to the rental platform. They acted quickly, taking down the listing and banning my brother's account. That didn't stop him from claiming he'd done nothing wrong. He argued that the money he made from renting out my room had gone towards shared bills, though he couldn't provide any proof that I owed him, or anyone else, a single dime. A couple of days later, I got a surprising message from the tenant. He apologized for the mess and even offered to compensate me for some of the damages. He said he had no idea the room belonged to someone else and felt genuinely bad about the whole thing. It was a small gesture, but it was more than my own family had done. As I processed everything, I couldn't help but reflect on how this wasn't the first time my brother had caused chaos in my life. Growing up, he was always the golden child, the one my parents bent over backward for. I'd always been expected to fend for myself, and this situation just brought all those old wounds to the surface. By the end of the week, I decided enough was enough. I changed the locks on my room and demanded the spare keys back. My parents called me petty, but I didn't care anymore. I needed to protect my space and my sanity. Still, I knew this wasn't over. I had to figure out my next steps, and that meant consulting a legal mediator. Update 2. After changing the locks and securing my room, I realized that the situation wasn't going to resolve itself. My brother, my parents, and even some extended family were still treating this as if it was no big deal. I knew I needed to address it head-on, so I decided to set up a family mediation. I hoped that with a neutral third party present, we could actually talk things through. Spoiler alert, that's not what happened. The mediation was set for the following weekend. I hired a professional mediator, someone experienced in handling family disputes. My parents, my brother, and I all sat in the living room. The atmosphere was tense from the start. My brother was glued to his phone, while my parents exchanged worried glances. I kept my cool, determined to lay everything out as calmly as possible. The mediator began by explaining the ground rules: no interruptions, no yelling, and everyone would get a chance to speak. It started off fine. I explained how the rental of my room had violated my trust, damaged my belongings, and caused unnecessary stress. I showed photos of the damages, the missing items, and the unauthorized listing. I thought that would be enough to make my case, but I underestimated my family's ability to twist the narrative. My brother's response was, predictably, defensive. He claimed he was only trying to help the family and that I was overreacting. He brought up how I had abandoned them for a month-long work trip, leaving the burden of the household on him. Never mind that I don't owe a dime for household expenses. He made it sound like I had left him to fend for himself. Then my parents chimed in. My dad reminded me about all the sacrifices they had made to put me through school, implying that this was just a small hiccup in comparison. My mom nodded along, saying that family should always come first and that I needed to move past this. They acted like renting out my room without permission was the equivalent of borrowing a cup of sugar from the neighbor. The mediator tried to keep things on track, asking everyone to focus on finding a resolution. But when I brought up the missing and damaged items, some of which were irreplaceable, my brother shrugged it off, claiming it wasn't his fault. He suggested the tenant was responsible, and that I should be grateful he had even gotten someone to pay for the room. My parents, instead of holding him accountable, doubled down on their stance that I was blowing things out of proportion. At this point, the mediator suggested setting clear boundaries moving forward. No one should enter my room without permission, and everyone needed to respect personal property. It seemed like a reasonable conclusion, but my family rejected it outright. My brother rolled his eyes, muttering something about how I was always so uptight, while my parents insisted that family members shouldn't have to ask for permission to use each other's spaces. That's when I laid down my own ultimatum. I told them that if they couldn't respect my boundaries, I would have no choice but to take legal action. My brother immediately shot back, saying if I took it that far, he'd go no contact with me. My parents looked horrified, but instead of addressing his behavior, they turned to me and begged me to reconsider. The mediation ended in chaos. My brother stormed out, slamming the door behind him. My parents stayed behind for a few minutes, pleading with me to let it go and keep the family together. I told them I couldn't just let this slide anymore. They left without saying much else. The next day, my brother leaked details of the mediation online. He painted himself as the victim, claiming I had threatened to sue him over a harmless mistake. He conveniently left out the part where he profited off my space without my knowledge and destroyed my belongings. His post gained traction, but this time, the internet wasn't on his side. People started digging into the story, piecing together his manipulative tactics. Commenters called him out for gaslighting me, and the backlash was brutal. At work, my colleagues noticed I seemed more stressed than usual. When I briefly explained the situation, they were surprisingly supportive. They told me I didn't need to let my family's dysfunction hold me back and encouraged me to focus on my career. Their support was a welcome relief in the middle of all the drama. Over the next week, the fallout deepened. Some relatives sided with my brother, claiming I was being too harsh, while others reached out to express their support. My parents started to waver, realizing how much damage my brother's actions had caused, but they still refused to fully take my side. It became clear that this wasn't just about the room anymore, it was about years of favoritism and unresolved family dynamics. By the end of the week, I knew I needed to prioritize my mental health. I started looking into therapy to help me process everything. This wasn't just about setting boundaries with my family, it was about learning how to move forward without their approval. Update 3. After the failed mediation and my brother's online antics, I realized that talking things out wasn't going to solve this mess. I decided to take the next step and file a police report. It wasn't an easy decision, but the unauthorized rental of my room, the damage to my belongings, and the missing items left me with no other choice. When I walked into the station and explained the situation to an officer, they took it seriously. The officer asked for evidence, so I handed over photos of the damage, screenshots of the rental listing, and proof of the missing items. I also mentioned that some of my belongings might have been sold without my consent. They assured me they would investigate and file a report for unauthorized entry, damage to property, and theft. Word got back to my brother quickly. He called me, furious, accusing me of being a sellout for involving the authorities. He even threatened to sue me for defamation, claiming I was trying to ruin his life. I ignored his threats. My parents weren't any better. They were outraged that I'd gone to the police, saying I was tearing the family apart and humiliating my brother in front of the community. The police investigation moved faster than I expected. Within a few days, they traced some of my missing items to online resale platforms. The listings were linked directly to accounts under my brother's name. When confronted, he tried to shift the blame onto the tenant, insisting that he had nothing to do with it. The police didn't buy his excuses, especially with the rental platform's cooperation. The platform provided records showing that my brother was the one who created the listing, handled bookings, and received payments. Armed with this evidence, I confronted my brother again. He doubled down on his denial, saying he had no idea how my things ended up being sold and claiming it was all a misunderstanding. My parents stood by him, repeating that I should drop it for the sake of family harmony. But the evidence was undeniable, and for the first time I noticed cracks in their support for him. They started asking questions about what really happened, though they still begged me not to escalate things further. I wasn't backing down. I pressed charges, which led to a court summons for my brother. News of the police report spread through our family friends and the local community, dividing opinions. Some people sided with my parents, saying I was being too harsh on my brother during a tough time. Others supported me, pointing out that my brother had clearly crossed a line. Meanwhile, therapy sessions became a lifeline for me. My therapist helped me unpack the emotional toll of the situation and focus on setting boundaries. It became clear that this wasn't just about the room or the missing items, it was about years of my family enabling my brother at my expense. For once, I started to feel like I was doing the right thing by standing up for myself. The situation escalated further when my brother posted another rant on social media. This time, though, his narrative didn't stick. With the police report and evidence now public knowledge, people started calling him out. The comments section of his post turned into a disaster for him, with strangers and even mutual acquaintances accusing him of lying and manipulating the story. Desperate to avoid legal consequences, my brother made a half-hearted offer to repay me for the damages. It was nowhere near the actual cost, and he framed it as a gesture of goodwill. I rejected it. This wasn't about money anymore, it was about accountability. My parents then stepped in, offering to cover the damages themselves if I agreed to drop the charges. I refused. If my brother didn't face the consequences of his actions now, when would he ever? The preliminary court hearing came quickly. My brother showed up looking nervous, probably realizing that his usual charm wouldn't work in front of a judge. He pled for leniency, claiming it was a one-time mistake made out of desperation. The judge didn't buy it entirely but postponed a decision, stating that more evidence would be reviewed before determining the next steps. By this point, public opinion had fully turned against my brother. His earlier attempts to gain sympathy had backfired, and people began distancing themselves from him. Even some family members who initially supported him started reaching out to me, admitting they hadn't realized how bad things were. My brother, however, seemed more isolated than ever. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a mix of emotions. The fight wasn't over yet, but I knew I was on the right track. For the first time in years, I wasn't letting my family guilt-trip me into silence. My next move was to prepare for the final court hearing, where a decision would be made about my brother's fate. Update 4. The court hearing marked a turning point. My brother was sentenced to community service and ordered to pay restitution for the stolen items and damages. The decision felt fair, but it set off a chain reaction that no one in the family was prepared for. My parents were livid. They cornered me after the hearing, accusing me of tearing the family apart and blaming me for the consequences my brother now faced. They acted as if his punishment was my fault, completely ignoring the fact that he had put himself in this position by renting out my room and selling my belongings. It felt like every conversation with them circled back to the same guilt-laden mantra: he's your brother. Family should stick together. Things got worse for my brother, too. With a tarnished reputation and no steady income, he couldn't keep up with his rent and was eventually evicted from his apartment. He moved back in with my parents, turning their home into a pressure cooker. At first, they seemed happy to have him back under their roof, but it didn't take long for the strain to show. His chaotic lifestyle, late nights, unpaid bills, and constant excuses quickly wore them down. Around this time, I received an anonymous letter in the mail. It wasn't signed, but the tone made it obvious it came from my parents. The letter was full of guilt-tripping statements about how family unity was more important than material things and how I needed to find it in my heart to forgive. They framed my brother's actions as a mistake born out of desperation, ignoring the fact that he had profited off my belongings and betrayed my trust. I took the letter to my therapist, who helped me see it for what it was, another attempt to scapegoat me for their inability to hold my brother accountable. Meanwhile, the tenant who had rented my room reached out to me again. They shared more details about their experience, revealing that my brother had completely misrepresented the situation. He had told them the room belonged to a cousin who was traveling long-term and didn't mind. He even provided fake documents to make it seem legitimate. The tenant felt terrible for unknowingly being part of the mess and offered more compensation, though I declined. Their honesty was enough. The fallout extended to extended family as well. News of the court decision spread, dividing opinions. Some relatives supported me, acknowledging that my brother had gone too far. Others sided with my parents, claiming I was being too harsh and should have let it go. Family gatherings became tense, with subtle jabs and whispered conversations creating an uncomfortable atmosphere. My brother, who used to bask in the spotlight at these events, now avoided them altogether. His downward spiral continued. Word of his antics had spread through our community, making it difficult for him to find steady work. Every time he landed a job, his reputation seemed to catch up with him, and he'd find himself back at square one. Financial instability became a constant for him, and the weight of his decisions finally started to hit home. But instead of taking responsibility, he doubled down on blaming me. While my brother's life unraveled, my career took a positive turn. I was offered a promotion at work, a significant step up that came with a raise and more responsibilities. It was a reminder that focusing on my own goals was paying off. But my parents, instead of congratulating me, remained distant. They barely acknowledged the news, and their usual calls became shorter and less frequent. It was clear they were giving me the silent treatment, their way of expressing disapproval without saying it outright. Then, an unexpected twist came from the internet. A post about my brother's antics went viral, detailing the rental debacle and the court decision. The story wasn't shared by me, but someone had pieced it together from public information and added their own commentary. The response was overwhelmingly in my favor, with people calling out my brother for his actions and sympathizing with what I had been through. The post even reached some of our mutual acquaintances, further isolating my brother socially. Desperation seemed to drive his next move. He issued an ultimatum to the family, saying he would cut ties with anyone who continued to support me. It was a bizarre threat, considering how much support he was still receiving despite everything. Some relatives backed off, afraid of causing more drama, but others called his bluff, refusing to choose sides. The tipping point came during a family dinner. My parents had insisted on hosting a gathering to mend fences, but it turned into anything but. My brother arrived late and spent most of the meal making passive-aggressive comments. Finally, one of our cousins, one of the few who had consistently supported me, called him out, pointing out that his actions had caused all this chaos in the first place. That sparked a shouting match, with my brother accusing everyone of turning against him. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. As the night wound down, one of my cousins pulled me aside and mentioned something cryptic. They hinted that my parents' favoritism toward my brother might have deeper roots than I realized. They didn't elaborate, but their words stuck with me. What could my parents be hiding, and why had they always gone to such lengths to shield my brother? Update 5. The cryptic hint from my cousins stuck with me, and I decided to follow up. I reached out to them privately, asking for clarification. At first, they hesitated, but after some convincing, they dropped a bombshell. For years, my parents had been financially supporting my brother. They had covered his debts, paid his rent when he couldn't, and even funneled money to him under the guise of helping the family. All while they had been lecturing me about self-reliance and hard work. The revelation hit hard. Not because my brother had been taking their money, I had come to expect that, but because my parents had kept it a secret while treating me like the golden child who didn't need any help. My cousin explained that my parents justified it by saying my brother needed more help because he wasn't as responsible as I was. They believed I'd always land on my feet, but he wouldn't. Armed with this knowledge, I confronted my parents. At first, they tried to downplay it, saying they'd only stepped in a few times. But when I pushed harder, the truth came out. They admitted they had been bailing him out for years. The money they claimed was tight when I was in school, it had gone to cover his failed ventures. The times they guilt-tripped me into giving up extras, they had used those funds to support him. They justified their actions by framing it as fair since I didn't need their help. Hearing this felt like a slap in the face. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. They had enabled his behavior for years, giving him a safety net while letting me fend for myself. It explains so much about their favoritism and their unwillingness to hold him accountable for his actions. That conversation was the last straw for me. I told my parents I couldn't continue a relationship with them or my brother if this was how things were going to be. I made it clear that I wasn't interested in hearing more excuses or apologies that weren't backed by real change. My parents tried to plead with me, but their reasoning was full of the same justifications that had caused this mess in the first place. I decided to go no contact with my brother entirely. With my parents, I set firm boundaries, limiting our interactions to the occasional update through a mutual relative. It was hard, but it was necessary. Meanwhile, the legal process reached its conclusion. My brother begrudgingly began making restitution payments as ordered by the court. It wasn't much, and it would take years for him to pay it all back, but it felt like a small victory. Not long after, my parents reached out through a long, emotional letter. They begged for forgiveness, but their words were laced with excuses about why they had favored my brother. They talked about how hard it was to see him struggle, and how they had thought they were doing the right thing. It was clear they still didn't fully understand the damage they had done, and without accountability, I couldn't see a path to reconciliation. As for my brother, his life continued to spiral. With his reputation in shambles, finding stable work became nearly impossible. He was evicted again and started burning bridges with even the few friends who had stuck by him. From what I heard through the grapevine, he moved in with a distant relative who wasn't thrilled about it. During this time, I leaned heavily on my friends and colleagues who became my chosen family. They celebrated my wins, listened when I needed to vent, and never once made me feel like I had to apologize for setting boundaries. One friend even surprised me with a thoughtful gift, a small replacement for one of the sentimental items that had been damaged in the fiasco. It wasn't about the object itself, it was about the gesture, which symbolized a fresh start for me. I shared my journey on social media, writing a post about the lessons I had learned through all this chaos. It wasn't a rant or a call out, it was a reflection on the importance of setting boundaries, holding people accountable, and protecting your peace. The post went viral, with countless people sharing their own experiences with toxic family dynamics. It was bittersweet to see how many others could relate, but it also reminded me that I wasn't alone. Over time, my parents began to subtly express regret through mutual relatives. They would ask how I was doing and mention that they wished things were different, but they never directly apologized, and without that, I kept my distance. As for my brother, he eventually disappeared from the family radar. The last I heard, he was moving from place to place, struggling to keep his head above water. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, just a sense of closure, knowing I had done what I could to protect myself. A year later, I moved into a new home, one that was truly mine. No more worrying about who had access to my space or what might happen while I was away. It felt like a new chapter, one where I could focus on my career, my relationships, and my own happiness. Looking back, the whole ordeal taught me hard lessons about trust, accountability, and the complexities of family. I've mourned the idea of the family I wished I had, but I'm also grateful for the strength I've gained and the people who have supported me along the way.